In the early 1990s, a country that had spent decades presenting itself as a stable, multi-ethnic federation watched its currency collapse into one of the worst hyperinflations in recorded history. That country was Yugoslavia, isolated by international sanctions while it ground through wars in Croatia and Bosnia. Sound familiar? If it does, that's because it's what's happening to Russia right now in the summer of 2026. So will things play out the same way? Will what happened in Yugoslavia repeat itself in Russia and end in that country's collapse? It's a scenario that we're going to take apart to get at the truth. Let's start with Yugoslavia, because the factors in its collapse are the lead-up for everything that follows. When the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia broke apart in 1991, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia that remained was essentially Serbia and Montenegro, unofficially ruled by Slobodan Milosevic, who would later become its president. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's a situation similar to how Vladimir Putin began his rise to power in Russia in the late 1990s. Yugoslavia kept fighting to hold territory and back Bosnian Serb forces in the brutal war unfolding next door. In May 1992, the United Nations Security Council responded with widespread sanctions, including a trade embargo, a freeze on financial transactions, and a cut-off of most international economic contact. The sanctions were tightened further in April 1993. On paper, the goal was to force Belgrade to stop supporting the war in Bosnia. In practice, the sanctions landed on an economy that was already structurally weak, and the combination proved catastrophic. The numbers are almost unbelievable in isolation. Within 3 months of the 1992 sanctions taking effect, industrial production had fallen by roughly 40%. By the end of that year, annual inflation in Serbia and Montenegro had reached about 19,810%. And that was just the warm-up. Through 1993, the country descended into one of the worst hyperinflations ever recorded. At its peak in January 1994, the monthly inflation rate hit roughly 313 million %. Daily inflation ran near 62% and hourly inflation was above 2%. Which meant prices could meaningfully move while you stood in a checkout line and would essentially double every 34 hours. By the end of 1993, the average monthly salary in Yugoslavia had collapsed to the equivalent of about $15. GDP fell around 30% that year, industrial production and investment both dropped by roughly 37%, and unemployment climbed past 24%. Behind those numbers was a government that had run out of real options. Milosevic's war effort, which was essentially arming and funding Bosnian Serb forces and sustaining his own military and police, was consuming more than 80% of the federal budget at points in this period. By December 1993, close to 95% of all government spending was being financed simply by printing new money. And the central bank had already been drained once before the sanctions even hit. In the final months before Croatia and Slovenia broke away, Milosevic's allies orchestrated a raid on the Serbian National Bank's hard currency reserves. They funneled $1.4 billion out to prop up the regime and its allies, while the money was still shared federal property. That heist helped push Croatia and Slovenia toward the exit, and it left the rump state with essentially nothing in reserve once the sanctions cut off any legitimate way to earn foreign currency back. So the state did what sanctioned war economies do. It improvised. Ordinary commerce moved off the collapsing dinar entirely and repriced in German marks, tracked as abstract points pegged to the mark's value, because nobody could plan a business or even a grocery run in a currency that might lose half its worth before lunch. The government delayed turning on heat in state-owned apartment blocks to save money, which pushed residents toward inefficient electric space heaters, which in turn overloaded the grid and caused blackouts. Pensioners learned to stall on paying any bill they could. This is a quirk of hyperinflation where the debt is technically lower. If someone owed 10,000 dinars at the beginning of the month, delaying payment by even a few days meant inflation had already eroded much of the debt's real value. And crucially for our purposes today, the war itself kept consuming manpower and materiel that a broke, sanctioned, isolated state had fewer and fewer legitimate ways to supply. Of course, Russia in 2026 is not Yugoslavia in 1993. Russia's economy is larger, more diversified, and despite years of sanctions, still exports enormous volumes of oil and gas, even if that trade has been complicated and rerouted rather than eliminated. Russia hasn't experienced anything close to Yugoslav-style hyperinflation, since its central bank has tools, reserves, and policy discipline that Belgrade's did not have in 1993. So Russian shelves are not about to be priced in points pegged to the yuan, but the deeper structural pattern in which the country is taking increasingly extreme economic measures is visibly forming in Russia right now. And the specific mechanism we want to focus on is what's happening to Russian fuel supply and to Russian labor. Let's start with fuel because it's likely the most visible daily problem in life for ordinary Russians. Since May 2026, Ukraine has dramatically intensified long-range strikes on oil refining infrastructure, not just pipelines and export terminals, but the refineries themselves, deep inside Russian territory. According to Medusa's reporting, every single one of Russia's 10 largest refineries has now come under attack. Ukraine's general staff reported that systematic strikes had disabled roughly 42.7% of Russia's projected oil refining capacity, with 8 refineries struck in June and more than 60 storage reservoirs destroyed or critically damaged. The Ukrainian assessment put cumulative financial losses to the Russian refining sector since August 2025 at roughly $13.5 billion. An independent analysis showed that Russian fuel production went down by as much as 25% year-on-year in June, leaving production about 20% below domestic demand. And while all these numbers might seem superfluous, the problem shows up immediately at the pump. As of mid-July, independent outlet Medusa counted at least 7 Russian regions and cities that had introduced fuel rationing by license plate. Oryol, Nizhny Novgorod, Pskov, Lipetsk and Kirov regions, plus Mordovia and Astrakhan. Kursk would end up joining them on July 15th. The restriction is simple and called an even-odd rule, under which plates beginning with odd digits can refuel on odd-numbered days. This method was similar to the one used in the 1970s in the US following the Iranian Revolution, cutting off a large portion of fuel exports from the region. However, this time the entire scheme is driven by an air campaign against the refineries themselves rather than a market embargo. The improvisation gets stranger from there, and this is where the Yugoslav echo gets hard to ignore. In Russia's Krasnodar region, the Dinsky district administration ordered public school teachers to give up part of their summer vacation to work shifts at gas stations. But they're not even pumping fuel, as there's not enough fuel for everyone. Instead, they're standing in the lot to manage the queues and calm down angry drivers. As for payment, the teachers are rewarded with complimentary tea and coffee. Local officials publicly insisted the duty was voluntary and limited to male teachers, on the theory that fuel shortages affect men more directly, but complaints surfacing in local community groups indicated female staff were being assigned the same shifts under an implicit threat of losing their jobs if they refused. One young teacher complained that she and her colleagues, some weighing under 110 pounds, were being sent out to physically manage crowds of frustrated drivers, unpaid and effectively without a choice. And in the Pskov region, authorities are recruiting volunteers and members of so-called people's squads to do similar duty at gas stations, all the while using recruitment notices that don't even mention pay. In Irkutsk, the regional government has floated an electronic reservation system to manage lines without deploying bodies at all. Instead, the government decided on harsher measures in late June, deploying the police and the National Guard to keep the peace. That's indicative of the government fully expecting possible regional unrest due to fuel concerns and getting ahead of it, something that was practically unthinkable for one of the largest exporters of oil and gas in the world. Notice what this is: a state redirecting civil servants, and teachers at that, out of their normal function and into logistics support for a fuel crisis its own choices helped create, because it doesn't have the money, the willing labor, or the administrative slack to solve the problem any other way. It's a small-scale, low-stakes version of exactly the improvisation we saw in Belgrade in 1993, when heat got turned off to save money and pensioners gamed payment deadlines to survive an economy that had stopped functioning in any normal sense. The fuel queues are unlikely to lead to hyperinflation, but the underlying reflex of squeezing public institutions and the public servants who man them is the same. Notably, this harkens back to the Yugoslavian case. In a commentary on the hyperinflation, the Cato Institute noted that all Belgrade's gas stations were closed, except for the ones serving foreign nationals and embassy personnel. If Russia's domestic fuel situation continues to develop in the same trajectory, we might not see teachers being required to work at stations for much longer because there won't be any work to do. And that line about a single gas station working goes back to Russia again, as earlier reports back at the beginning of July already indicated that some municipalities have started adopting a priority list of who gets to avoid the line. This line of thinking and acting perfectly encapsulates the growing divide between the acting government and the actual people in Russia who are supporting said government, perhaps for the wrong reasons. Now pivot to labor, because this is where the parallel to a state running out of willing bodies for its war becomes explicit. In mid-July 2026, the independent Russian broadcaster TV Rain obtained and published a leaked document titled Plan for Selecting Candidates for Contract Service in 2026. The plan covers the Maisky district in the Republic of Buryatia in Russia's Far East. According to the document, the plan does something we don't normally associate with the private economy. It lists every company operating in the district, how many people each one employs, and how many of those employees are men between 20 and 60. Most importantly, it also lists a specific quota of workers each company is required to send to fight in Ukraine. And the worst thing is that this is unlikely to be an isolated case, as sources that were responsible for the leak suggest that the same quotas are being applied in other regions across the Federation. Before we get into the gritty mechanics of the move, make sure to hit the subscribe button to get more daily videos. Here at the Military Show, we are determined to give you the latest news and detailed analyses on all things in geopolitics. Back to the leaked documents, the mechanics behind the quota are maximizing either government profits or bodies on the ground, in a sort of cruel calculation that has been pervasive throughout the war effort. The district head receives a target number from regional headquarters and then distributes that target across local employers. Each business is assigned a specific number of workers it must produce for military contract service. But if a company's management doesn't want to send its own staff, it has an alternative. It can pay for the service instead, contracting with a designated firm that specializes in what's euphemistically called candidate selection for the war. The reported going rate is 100,000 rubles, or roughly $1,300, as of mid-July, per person the company doesn't supply directly. This is not even limited to the private sector. The same plan requires the Maisky District Hospital to supply 2 employees for military service, despite the region already suffering from an acute shortage of medical personnel. The quotas don't ask which sectors can spare the workers, as the government simply assigns numbers and expects them to be filled. But this system isn't new. It's evolved and started as early as 2024. Back then, authorities began demanding that entrepreneurs supply people for the war, backing the demand with threats of surprise inspections for businesses that didn't comply. By 2025, that had hardened into the explicit buyout scheme we see today. Businesses could pay their way out of sending workers, but each person short of the quota would cost the company 450,000 rubles, or roughly $6,000. This is more than 4 times what the going institutional rate is in Buryatia under the newer 2026 plan. The discrepancy here suggests the price of buying out of this system varies sharply by region rather than following any single national scale. But what's consistent across both cases is the underlying logic in which a company's workforce has effectively become a resource the state can tax, whether in bodies or in rubles. And there's a reason the pressure is intensifying rather than easing. Maisky District's quota for 2026 requires enterprises to send 61 people to the front. This is roughly 65% more than the district's target from the previous year. And in that year, only 13 people actually signed contracts. In other words, the district massively missed its prior quota, and the response from regional authorities was not to scale expectations down, but to nearly double them for the following year. In essence, the state is trying to curb its manpower shortage by using even less forgiving measures. This brings us to the most serious escalation, which is arguably worse than what the people in former Yugoslavia ever had to endure. Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty published a detailed report in early July, describing a shift from financial and administrative pressure to outright forcible recruitment. The report indicates that this effort was concentrated around the city of Penza, roughly 625 kilometers southeast of Moscow. According to RFERL, men there have been detained off city streets, then taken to military recruitment offices, and pressured or physically coerced into signing contracts that send them to fight in Ukraine. The report shared a video filmed by a bystander which showed a group of men sitting in a minivan while people outside commented that the men were being pressured into going. Russian law enforcement subsequently and publicly denied that any coercion had occurred. RFERL's reporting also includes individual cases that are hard to categorize as anything other than what the Ukrainians call busification, an informal term for grabbing military-aged men off the street and hauling them away in vans. The practice was initially associated with Ukraine's own mobilization struggles, showing that both sides are actually suffering from the same issue. But in Ukraine's case, President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged the issue in early 2026 and instructed the Ministry of Defense to solve it. By contrast, the busification in Russia seems to be going completely out of legal bounds. The report indicates that the state simply denied the events as untrue and shelved them to one side, which also hides how prevalent it could be throughout the country. And because Russian authorities deny the practice happens, there's also no official channel logging who was taken, where, or under what pretext. This is exactly why RFERL's sourcing is built entirely on anonymous relatives and lawyers rather than any government record. Ukraine's territorial recruitment center abuses are heavily documented specifically because they're not denied. Instead, they're argued about in parliament and covered by name in Ukrainian outlets. Then there's the supposed growth in incidents over the past years. Coupled with the increasing quotas, it suggests the Kremlin is actively trying to resort to this measure instead of announcing another round of partial mobilizations. The last time a mobilization was announced in 2022, it was followed by hundreds of thousands of people leaving the country, possibly never to return, which only further damaged Russia's economy. Layer these threads together, and the picture that emerges is a war economy running short of the two things that it needs most: fuel and manpower. Ukraine's strikes on refineries are creating exactly the kind of resource squeeze that sanctions created for Yugoslavia in 1992. And on the manpower side, we see a state moving through the same pipeline as Yugoslavia did as the war dragged on and volunteers dried up. First incentives, then administrative quotas assigned to businesses as though workers were a taxable commodity. Then a cash buyout system whose price keeps climbing. Then outright abduction from city streets. Milosevic also kept fighting past the point that his economy could sustain, because backing down carried its own unacceptable political cost. None of this means Russia is certainly going to fracture the way Yugoslavia did. Yugoslavia's collapse was also driven by an international sanctions regime specifically engineered to force a change, layered on top of a multitude of internal systems that either didn't work or were actively sabotaged by the ruling party trying to make a quick profit. Instead, Russia still receives a healthy sum from its trade with China and India, and it still has access to more fuel when needed. And despite the sanctions imposed by the West, something that curiously one former Yugoslav country refused to do in principle, Russia's economy is still technically growing, even at a much lower rate than expected. So it's more accurate to say that Russia's current system is strained rather than collapsing. Strain means the country can claw itself back out, usually via external aid or internal reform. Neither of those two options is something that the current Russian government is likely to do. With the first, if China bails Russia out, that would essentially mean a public surrender to China as the bloc leader, rather than a supposed equal. With the second, Putin's entire regime hinges on having the same people in charge and not changing them. So if there were widespread calls for reform, it would usually be in the same form as what happened on October 5, 2000, when the people of Yugoslavia overthrew Milosevic. Which means that we're on the other possible path following strain, where it's a possible indicator of widespread failure. But this also leads to the same two issues, where something has to break. At this point, we're watching whether that will be the war in Ukraine or Russia itself. But that means the triggering factor here is how much support Putin has, and that support has been slowly waning with each passing month. To learn more, check out this video and make sure to subscribe to The Military Show for daily news and the most important developments in the war in Ukraine and global geopolitics. And thank you, as always, for watching.